What makes a bad CEO? And more importantly, why do companies keep making the same leadership mistakes over and over again? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most bad CEOs aren't stupid, unqualified, or incompetent. Quite the opposite. They are often excellent at the job they used to have and completely unsuited to the job they've been promoted into. Kathleen Kennedy, the now former head of Lucasfilm, is one of the clearest examples of how this happens. This isn't a video about Star Wars fandom, culture wars, or whether or not you liked a particular movie. It's a case study in leadership failure, how a highly competent, highly respected executive ended up struggling in a role that demanded a fundamentally different skill set. I'm Mike. I've worked across pharma, tech, and consulting. I've held C-level roles in international companies, and I have a background in business, HR, and psychology. I've worked with executives for over a decade. I've advised them on how they lead, and I've supported them to become stronger in their role. Today, we're looking at why CEOs fail and why Kathleen Kennedy's tenure at Lucasfilm is such a useful example of how organizations accidentally create bad CEOs. Kathleen Kennedy has been around Hollywood for more than 50 years. She started back in the 1970s as a production assistant on projects headed up by household names like Steven Spielberg and Frank Marshall. She landed her first producer role in 1982 on the smash hit Steven Spielberg movie E.T. From there, she moved on to more Spielberg productions, including the Indiana Jones series, where she was also introduced to another heavyweight in the industry, the man behind the Star Wars franchise, George Lucas. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, she cemented herself as a prolific and successful producer, with producer and executive producer credits on movies with massive budgets and massive commercial expectations. She was known for controlling costs better than most. The sets of her movies were comparatively drama-free. Talent was kept happy but in line. Directors had creative freedom, but they stuck to studio constraints. And she could transition seamlessly from technically complex productions to art house dramas. 2012 marked her transition from producer to co-chair of Lucasfilm alongside George Lucas. With Kathleen Kennedy at the head, Lucasfilm relaunched the next phase of the Star Wars franchise. She oversaw the launch of The Force Awakens, a box office hit and to this day one of the highest grossing domestic releases in US history. The following movies were less successful. They were still massive by most standards, but for an IP like Star Wars, performance diminished from release to release over time. Looking at her tenure as the head of Lucasfilm, there are two fair interpretations. On the one hand, the franchise reportedly generated more than $5 billion. What's less stellar is the broader state of the Star Wars universe after her tenure. Audience engagement appears to have weakened when looking at box office trends and reported viewer commitment. While specific streaming numbers aren't public, media reporting and studio statements have suggested that not all shows have met expectations. More importantly, unlike her producer years, many projects during her time as studio head were marked by on-set turmoil, creative direction disputes, director exits, and a fragmented, inconsistent release schedule. So the question is, why? I'm Mike. This is the channel Work Unusual, where we talk about business and careers. If you are enjoying this video and other content on this channel, the best way to support the channel is by clicking the subscribe button. So please do so right now. Subscribe. Thanks a ton. A studio head is in many ways a CEO. The CEO has two core responsibilities: defining direction and ensuring the organization moves in that direction. The first is strategy, the second is strategy execution. From the outside, it's easy to assume that being a studio head is about finding good scripts, hiring the right actors and making a good movie and moving on to the next one. But that's not what the job actually is. A studio is a network of talent built around a specific creative edge. It's about attracting that talent and building repeatable capabilities. Just as some game studios specialize in live service games or RPGs, film studios develop niches: indie dramas, low-budget action, prestige films, or blockbuster franchises. With cinematic universes, the complexity increases dramatically. You're no longer just producing individual projects. You're managing internal consistency across multiple products. Storylines, canon, themes, release timing, all of those become strategic constraints. Release schedules also matter. If you're making standalone blockbusters, timing is relatively simple. You just don't capitalize on your own releases and pay attention to when everybody else is releasing their blockbuster. But when you're building towards a cinematic event, what comes before and how it feeds into what comes next becomes critical. That strategic complexity cascades all the way down to individual productions. Standalone films can tolerate creative deviation. Cinematic universes can't. In those environments, canon, narrative, coherence, themes, and release cadence become non-negotiable guardrails. The studio head's job is to enforce those constraints, often by saying no. So think of it this way. The studio head is the captain on the deck. The captain sets the course, checks the engines are running, and confirms there's enough fuel. But the captain doesn't pick up a wrench or start fixing the engine themselves. And this is where Kathleen Kennedy ran into trouble. Because if there's one thing she consistently did, it was operating at the production level. And especially during the sequel trilogy, the films appeared highly inconsistent. And 3 examples illustrate this. First, the trilogy was widely criticized for lacking a coherent, overarching narrative. The films functioned more as standalone projects than as parts of a unified story. Second, the release schedule was uneven with significant gaps. For a cinematic universe, maintaining momentum is vital. Missing releases risks losing audience engagement. For standalone films, a 1-year delay might not matter. For connected narratives, it does. Third, talent turnover. Director changes happen, but context matters. Imagine preparing to launch the iPhone 17 and within a single year the chief hardware officer is replaced 3 times. That kind of instability will have consequences. Kathleen Kennedy struggled to consistently set direction and enforce constraints. She wasn't good at saying no early, and she remained deeply involved in operational decision-making. In short, she wasn't acting like a studio head. She was acting like a producer. A producer is by definition an operational facilitator. They either have the wrench in the engine room or they know exactly where to find one. The producer sits between the creative vision of the director and the constraints set by the studio. They are facilitators, they're translators, they're fixers. They are project managers who keep productions moving within budget and on schedule while keeping people motivated and aligned. What producers don't do is set strategic constraints. They don't need to view their project in the context of every other project. Their question is usually, we're moving, how do we keep moving? The studio head asks a different question. Are we moving in the right direction? And should we be moving at all? A lot of what makes a great producer is the opposite of what makes a great CEO. The producer thinks tactically. The studio head thinks strategically. The producer is flexible and the studio head imposes constraints. The producer tries to keep people happy. The CEO accepts that people will be disappointed. The producer fights fires, but the CEO prevents them. And the producer works in the engine room, where the studio head stands in the lookout tower. Kathleen Kennedy's story isn't about incompetence. It's about mismatch. She was exceptional at one thing. She was one of the best producers Hollywood has ever seen. She knew how to manage chaos, solve problems under pressure, and deliver results in the moment. But a studio head isn't paid to solve today's problems. A studio head is paid to prevent tomorrow's problems. The CEO's job is to set direction, to define constraints and say no early, not to jump into the engine room and start fixing fires. And that transition from producer to studio head is where things broke down. Lucasfilm didn't collapse. It made a lot of money, but it lost coherence, stability, long-term direction. It's the kind of failure that doesn't show up immediately on a balance sheet, but it appears everywhere else. This was the Peter principle in action. Organizations promote people based on past success, assuming excellence in one role automatically will translate into another. And too often, it doesn't. Kathleen Kennedy didn't fail because she lacked talent. She failed because the role required her to stop doing the thing she was best at, and no one, including the organization, ever forced that transition to happen. The lesson for me isn't about Star Wars, it's about leadership. The most dangerous CEO isn't the unqualified one. It's the one who's highly competent, just at the wrong job. Share your thoughts in the comments. Remember to subscribe. See you soon.